Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today to celebrate the enduring promise of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and recommit to its goals. We do so with the memory of great human rights champions in mind. Champions such as Eleanor Roosevelt, who played a central role in the creation of the Declaration and who once said, "Where, after all, do universal human rights begin? In small places, close to home, so close and so small that they cannot be seen on any maps of the world. Yet they are the world of the individual person, the neighborhood he lives in, the school or college he attends, the factory farm or office where he works." The United States has been a global champion for universal human rights since well before the Declaration was adopted in 1948 and every day since. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has dedicated much of his tenure at the State Department to re-energizing the global commitment to human rights and giving voice to those around the world who are denied their human dignity. In May of last year, the Department of State announced the creation of the Commission on Unalienable Rights, designed to provide advice and recommendations to the Secretary on international human rights matters. In its deliberations and final report, the Commission necessarily focused considerable attention on the Universal Declaration and noted that the political ideals and traditions of the United States were central to its development. The decision to focus on the Universal Declaration during this year's high-level week reflects the Trump administration's deep commitment to human rights around the world, a focus on the fundamental nature of those rights, as well as the recognition that the United Nations has not always proven a successful defender of them. As we all know, the UN is a reflection of its membership, and on human rights matters, far too many member states fall short of their commitments to the Universal Declaration. And so, it has never been more important for the responsible nations of the world to return to their commitments made through the Universal Declaration and give renewed emphasis to human rights in everything the UN does. I want to thank Secretary Pompeo for his leadership on these issues and for his moral clarity that he brings to his work every day. With that, Mr. Secretary, the floor is yours.
Good morning, and thank you, Ambassador Kraft. The United States is lucky to have a UN ambassador who is such a stalwart champion of human rights, the cause that brings us together here today. The horrors of the Second World War made clear the duty of every sovereign nation to protect the dignity of all human beings. And so, in 1948, the United Nations General Assembly approved the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The UDHR's the first line reads as follows: "Recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world." Those words echo America's Declaration of Independence, which states that the purpose of our government is to secure unalienable rights, the rights inherent in all persons. The UDHR also drew on the wisdom of the Abrahamic faiths, Confucianism, Hinduism, and other religious, philosophical, and political traditions. We must defend unalienable rights today because the International Human Rights Project is in crisis. Authoritarian governments, from China to Iran to Venezuela, are depriving our fellow human beings of their basic rights. Meanwhile, many multinational organizations have lost their way, focusing on partisan policy preferences while failing to defend fundamental rights. And even many well-intentioned people assert new and novel rights that often conflict. To uphold universal human rights, we should look to the framers of the UDHR, who identified a clear set of principles that apply to all people, everywhere, and at all times. They stood unwaveringly in defense of the dignity of every human being. And so, too, should we. To help us do that, I convened the U.S. State Department's Commission on Unalienable Rights. The Commission found in the American constitutional tradition wide and deep support for unalienable rights. We hope the Commission's recently published report will serve as an inspiration to other nations and to peoples all across the world. They should turn to their traditions and rededicate themselves to their moral, philosophical, and religious resources to affirm the rights inherent in all persons, the rights at the core of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This work is vital. We must rediscover the nature of human rights, and we must have the courage to defend them. Your presence here today gives me great confidence that we're up to that task. Thank you again, Ambassador Kraft, for convening us. May God bless you all.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Robert Destro. I am the Assistant Secretary here at the State Department for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. And I'd like to welcome you to this conversation about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the panel conversation we're about to have. I'd like to begin by thanking Secretary Pompeo and Ambassador Kraft for kicking off this conversation today. And I'd like to especially thank Secretary Pompeo for starting the conversation within the State Department on the fundamental principles that guide our understanding of human rights. As I begin the panel discussion today, I'd like to make a couple of preliminary comments, and that is, what it is we're about to do this morning, to talk about the culture of human rights. And we must consider in our discussions that the discussion of human rights does not occur in a vacuum. As the Secretary has pointed out, there are many problems around the world. As Assistant Secretary for Human Rights, Democracy, and Labor, I have to deal with these problems on a daily basis. And so what we need to do is remember that every legal culture around the world has its fundamental words and its fundamental concepts. And so when we talk about our commitments to human rights, we're locating ourselves in particular times and places, and we deal with particular outlooks on these issues. So this morning, I'm very pleased to be joined by three distinguished legal scholars from the Confucian, Islamic, and Western traditions. So let me begin by introducing them briefly. First, I'd like to introduce my friend and colleague, Marianne Glendon. She is the Learned Hand Professor of Law Emerita at Harvard University and a former ambassador to the U.S. Ambassador to the Holy See. And I might add, the leading American expert on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. She is the author of I think the definitive book on the Universal Declaration, A World Made New, Eleanor Roosevelt and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It was published in 2001. I'd also like to introduce my colleague, Pak Yahya. Kai Haji Yahya Khalil Staquf is a distinguished Muslim scholar and the co-founder of a global movement, Humanitarian Islam, that seeks to reform obsolete tenets of Islamic orthodoxy that enjoin religious hatred, supremacy, and violence by restoring Rahmah, universal love and compassion, to its rightful place as the primary message of Islam. As General Secretary of Indonesia's Nahdlatul Ulama, the world's largest Muslim organization, it has over 50 million members and 14,000 madrasas. Imam Staquf is bringing the civilizational wisdom and spiritual authority of Islam Nusantara, East Indies Islam, to the world stage, where a harsh and repressive and all too often violent understanding of Islam has predominated for decades. And then lastly, and certainly I'm very thrilled to have Mr. Hu Ping, a political philosopher in the Confucian tradition and a writer. He received his master's degree in philosophy from Beijing University. In 1971, he was a participant, 1979, I'm sorry. Mr. Hu Ping was a participant in the Zindan Democracy Wall movement. And in 1980, He was elected to be a delegate of the National People's Congress representing the Haidan district of Peking University. In January 1987, he came to the United States to pursue a doctoral degree at Harvard. He is the chairman of the Chinese Alliance for Democracy and served in that position from 1988 through 91. And he has served as a chief editor of the Beijing Spring and China Spring magazines. He served as a board member of Human Rights in China and as the president for China's democratic transition. His books are fascinating and I commend them to you. And so now let me begin by raising some questions for our panelists. And I think I'm going to start this morning with Pak Yahya, if you don't mind, and would like to ask you if you believe that the underlying values and aspirations of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights are in line with the aspirations of Islam.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat pagi Pak Bob Destro. Selamat pagi semuanya. Terima kasih telah mengundang saya di dalam forum ini. Jadi Islam dibawa oleh Nabi Muhammad SAW sebagai agama dengan mengemban aspirasi peradaban, yaitu apa yang dianggap sebagai cita-cita ideal untuk diwujudkan di dalam peradaban umat manusia. Elemen paling mendasar dari aspirasi peradaban itu adalah pertama, jelas ketuhanan, dan kedua, memuliakan manusia, dignifying human beings, dan ketiga, rahmah, compassion. Kalau kita ingat aspirasi peradaban yang mendasar yang dibawa oleh Islam, kita bisa melihat dengan jelas sekali bahwa aspirasi peradaban itu telah tertampung sepenuhnya di dalam Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Nah, kita melihat kemudian bahwa di dalam perjalanan sejarah terjadi pergulatan yang sangat dinamis yang diwarnai oleh pertama kebutuhan untuk mengabadikan aspirasi peradaban itu, tapi juga dengan upaya untuk mengatasi tantangan-tantangan realistis di dalam realitas kenyataan sejarah yang dihadapi. Dan pergulatan itu seringkali kemudian menghasilkan hal-hal, lembaga-lembaga, ekspresi-ekspresi yang mungkin tidak ideal, tetapi harus selalu diingat bahwa cita-cita mendasar yang harus dituju, yang harus dicapai adalah aspirasi peradaban yang mulia yang dibawa oleh agama sejak awal. Dan sekarang adalah saatnya seluruh umat manusia sungguh-sungguh memperhatikan kebutuhan untuk menerima prinsip-prinsip yang ada di dalam Universal Declaration of Human Rights ini sebagai nilai bersama untuk mewujudkan peradaban bersama. Karena kita sekarang memasuki satu era di mana seluruh umat manusia di dunia ini berproses bersama untuk mewujudkan satu peradaban global yang tunggal, yang tidak terpisah-pisah satu sama lain. Maka supaya nanti akan tercipta satu tatanan yang harmonis untuk semua orang, seluruh umat manusia harus punya satu nilai bersama yang diterima sebagai konsensus, sebagai dasar hidup berdampingan secara damai dan harmonis. Dan nilai-nilai tentang hak asasi manusia ini adalah nilai yang mutlak tidak boleh dikeluarkan dari konsensus bersama di dalam peradaban global di masa depan.
Global civilization in the future.
Thank you very much for those comments. And let me now turn to Mr. Hu Ping And if you would address the question, some people say that the concept of human rights is a Western creation. It only belongs to Western civilization, not a universal value. From the Chinese perspective, how would you react to that?
人权当然是普世价值。
Human
我们
rights,
知道，
of
在
course,
起
are
草世界
universal
人权宣言
values.
的过程中，
As we know,
一位
when the
名叫张
Declaration
同
was
春
being
的中
drafted,
国学者
a
兼
Chinese
外交
scholar
官做出了很
and
重要的贡献。
diplomat named Zhang
起
Pengchun
初，
made
不
a
少来
significant
自基督
contribution.
教传统的
At
国家的代
first,
表
many
主张，
representatives from
就
nations of
像美
Christian
国的独立
tradition
宣言那样，
proposed to
把人权表述为
define human
人
rights
人被
as
造
the
而成的
American Declaration
造
of
物主
Independence,
赋予他们
such as
若干
all
不可
men
剥夺的
were
权利。
created equal, that they are
张
endowed
彭
by
春
their
不
creator
同
with
意，
certain
他建议
unalienable
把
rights.
人权表述
But
为
he
人
disagreed.
人生
He
而自由
proposed
平等，
this statement
他们
instead, that
富有
all human beings are
有
born
资
free
格
and
享有
equal,
各种权
and
利
they
和
are
自由。
endowed with and
这种表
entitled
述
to all
可以
kinds of
适用
rights
于
and
各
freedom.
种非
And
基督
because
教传统的国
this
家，
expression is
更
appropriate
好地体现
for
了
all
人权的
non-Christian
普适性，
nations, and thus
因此
better
得到广泛的
exemplifies
赞
the
同，
universal
写进
nature
了
of
世界
human
人权
rights.
宣言的文
It
本。
won broad consent and was
所谓
incorporated in
普
the
世价
text
值呢
of，
有
the
两层意
Declaration.
思。
Well,
一是
when we
说
talk about
这种价
universal
值
values,
具
there
有
are actually
普
two
遍适
meanings.
用性，
One,
不分
they
宗
refer
教、
to
国家
is
和民族
universal
都适用。
nature in
另一层意
application,
思是
regardless
说，
of religion,
这种
country,
价
or
值
nation, or people.
在大多数地
Second,
方
they are
被很
values
多人
that
共同发
are
现和认同。
identified and
哪怕这种
recognized
发
by
现
most people in
还比较
most
模糊，
places, even
缺
though
少很准
such an
确、明确的
identification might still
准
be
确清晰的
ambiguous,
表达，
or
哪怕
people
这种
might
认
still
同
lack
还没
precise
有
or
表
clear
现在
expression
外部
for
行
it,
为上，
or
没有体
its
现在
recognition has
制度
yet
性
to
的
be
安排上。
reflected on people's
我们
external
就拿
behavior or
第一人权
materialized in
言论
certain
自由作为例子，
institutional arrangements.
在
Take
中
the
国古
first
代
right, for
就有
example,
一句成语
freedom of
叫
speech.
“言
There is a
者无
Chinese
罪
saying that came
这句
from
话一
ancient
直流传
times
到今天。
that says, "He who
在北京
speaks
的
his
天安门
mind
广场，
commits no
天安
crime."
门城
We
楼
still
两
use that
侧
expression.
有两座
There are
高
two
大的
colossal
汉白玉的
columns
华表，
made of white
华表
jade
的
on
前
each
身
side
呢
of the
叫
gate
半
of
玉。
heavenly peace, which
相
is
传
in front
在
of
上
the
古的
forbidden
尧
city.
舜时代，
As symbols,
中国
they
人就
replaced
在交通要
the
道上
wood
树
columns
立
used
高
in the
大的木
ancient
头柱子，
imperial courts
专门给人
of the
民
famed
发表各
emperors
种
of
不
Yao
同的
and
意
Shun.
见。
Legend
包括
has
批
it
评
that,
统
and
治
these
者的意
columns
见。
were placed
后来
there
呢，
by the
放牧失去了
sides
它
of
这种
main
功
roads so
能，
the
变
people
成了装
could
饰物。
post their opinions, including criticisms
不
of
错，
the
在中国的传
emperors.
统文
However,
化中，
these columns
我
eventually
们没
lost
有
their
人
functionality
权、
and
自
became
由这两个
merely
词汇。
objects of
但是这不
declaration.
等于说
So
中国人
even
没有
though
对人权自由的
we
感
might
觉
not
和追
have
求。
the
中国
words
过
for
去
human
也有
rights or
一些
freedom,
词
but
汇
it doesn't really
和
mean
人
that
权
the
呢和
Chinese
自由
people
啊
were
非
indifferent
常
to
接
human
近。
rights or freedom or did not
所以一
decipher
个
them.
好
Some
的词
Chinese
汇，
terms or concepts
那
used in the past
它
were
既是发
actually
现，
used
又是
or
发
actually
明。
are very close to
说
that
它
of
是
human
发
rights and
现，
freedom.
因
Good
为它
language,
不
just
是
like
无
good
中生有，
ideas, can be
没
said
有
as
依托，
discovery and invention.
而是反映了我们
Discovery
本
because
来
it
就
is
有
not
的
from
一
nowhere or
些感
baseless.
觉
In
或
this
者愿
case,
望。
it reflects
说
a
它是发
certain
明的，
sentiment or
因
desire
为
that we
有了
always
这个
have.
词汇之
We
后，
call that
那
invention
我们
because
原来的
after
感觉和
we
追求
have to stir
变
up
得
a
更
concept,
清楚、更
our
明确，
sentiment or
也
desire
更现实。
for it will
这
become
就是为什
that
么中国
much
人
more
一
precise,
旦
clear,
接触
vivid.
到西方人
And
这
that's
个
why
人权
when
这
the
个词汇
Chinese
之后，
people
立刻
heard
就很
of
赞同，就
these
感觉
concepts, even
对，
though
这
they
就是
were
我们一
originally
直在
raised
追
in
求
the
的东
West,
西。
they bond immediately to that.
在美国首
And
都
they
华
say
盛
that's
顿
it. These
的
are the
华盛
things
顿
we
纪
have
念
been
碑里
longing for.
有一块汉
Inside
字的
the
石碑，
Washington Monument in the U.S.
上面写
capital of
着
Washington, D.C.,
中国
there is
清
a
朝官
granite
员
plaque
儒
with
生
Chinese
徐
characters
继瑜
carved
的
on
一
it.
句话，
It is a copy of an
他对
article
华盛
written
顿总
by
统
a Qing
称赞
Dynasty
备至，
Mandarin and student on
批 习近平就
Confucianism
写道
by the name of
说
Xi
美国国
Jinping,
父
in
创
which
建
he
的这种制
bestows
度，
the highest
几乎达到了
compliments on
中国
President
人古
Washington.
老的
He wrote
天下为
in
公
this
的
article
境界，
that the system
和
created
我
by the
们
American
上
founding
古时代
fathers
的
had almost
三
reached the
代的理
heights
想
of the
非常
ancient
接近。
Chinese ideal in which the world belongs to
在
all and all
108
serve
年
each
前，
other. This
中国
is
就
known
建
as
立
the
了
ideal
亚洲
state,
第一个共和
exemplified
国。
by the three
今天的
ancient
台湾
Chinese
有着
dynasties.
很成熟的
108
民
years
主制度，
ago, China founded the
在人
very
权和
first
自由
republic
方
in
面
Asia,
有
the
着非
Republic
常
of
良好的
China.
记录。
Today,
台
Taiwan
湾
maintains an
要比大
excellent
陆
record of
更
human
好
rights
的
and
保持了
freedom.
中
At the
国
same
的
time,
文化
it
传统，
preserves
所以这就有力的证
Chinese
明了
culture
人
and
权价值
tradition
的
better than
普适性。
mainland China. This is the most powerful testament to the universal nature of human rights.
Well, thank you so much. And now that you have mentioned kind of the cultural elements out of which the Universal Declaration arises and its congruence with those cultural elements, let me turn to Professor Glendon and ask, what elements of the U.S. rights tradition are reflected in the UDHR, and how did you portray that in the recent report of the Commission?
Thank you, Secretary Destro, for this opportunity to exchange thoughts with my two distinguished colleagues, Hu Ping and Pak Yaya. Today we're talking about the need for a rededication to the principles of the UDHR, and your question about what went into the creation of the UDHR and what specifically was contributed by the United States prompts me to observe first that this 75th anniversary of the founding of the UN is perhaps the perfect time to reflect on what an extraordinary achievement it was for the members of the already diverse UN in 1948, contentious in 1948, the Cold War was underway, trouble in the Middle East. What an extraordinary achievement it was for the members of the early UN to achieve agreement on a few basic principles that in fact transformed the moral terrain of international relations. And I'd like to mention just a few points about that history that are highly relevant today as we ponder the future of human rights and as we deal occasionally with the question of whether the UDHR is or is not a Western document. If we were to go back to 1948 and say, how is it possible that in this already diverse 58-member United Nations, how is it possible that they approved the UDHR without a single dissenting vote? And in my view, three factors stand out that made that possible. And one was that the list of principles in the UDHR was kept very small. The most basic, the most fundamental freedoms that belong to men and women simply by virtue of being human. Another factor relevant to the question of Westernness is that the UDHR was preceded by a study commissioned by UNESCO that gathered together thinkers, distinguished thinkers from all over the world, many different traditions. And they found, somewhat to their own surprise, they found that there was a foundation, there was support in the world's great philosophical and religious traditions for a very small group of basic ideas about human decency. And the third factor was that armed with that study, the actual framers of the UDHR were participants in a remarkable intercultural collaboration. Among the most influential were the Chinese Confucian scholar already mentioned, Peng Chongjiang, Charles Malik, who was the chief spokesman for the Arab League at the time, and who cooperated with the French Zionist René Cassin. And of course, as we've mentioned, Eleanor Roosevelt, who chaired the drafting committee and who brought with her not only the US tradition, which was highly convergent with the principles of the Universal Declaration, but also the commitment of her husband's administration and the administration under which she served to the idea so beautifully expressed in the UN Charter and in the Universal Declaration of, quote, better standards of life in larger freedom. I would say the fact that agreement was achieved at a time when the world was in great turmoil as it is now, is a fact that should give us hope for the future. And it prompts me to suggest, Mr. Secretary, that it would be helpful for the present members of the United Nations to refresh their country's own understanding of the UDHR's principles. That is what Secretary Pompeo asked the US Commission on Unalienable Rights to do, and that is what they did in order to reground those universal principles in the specific context of a rights tradition that drew on a biblical inheritance, that drew on an English inheritance of freedom, and that drew on the experience of democratic living in small, tight-knit communities. Secretary Pompeo suggested that the work of our commission could help to strengthen, I'm quoting his language here, the intellectual defense of the principles of the great post-World War II Human Rights Project. And we hope that other countries might undertake a similar exercise. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Glendon. And you raise a very, very interesting point about intercultural collaboration. And that certainly, that kind of collaboration begins certainly with a conversation like we're having today. I'll make a few more comments about that toward the end. But let me go back to Pacquiao for a moment. And we've talked about intercultural collaboration, and we've talked about whether or not the principles in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights are particularly Western, and the answer has been no. But if the fundamental aspirations of Islam and those of the UDHR in alignment, why was the Cairo Declaration of Human Rights in Islam written and presented?
Ya, saya seperti telah disampaikan tadi bahwa
as I said earlier,
UDHR ini disebut universal bukan hanya karena kita membutuhkan satu konsensus universal tentang prinsip-prinsip hak asasi manusia, tapi karena memang di dalam realitas, memang di dalam kenyataannya, apa yang ada di dalam UDHR ini bisa diterima oleh semua budaya, semua
to almost all cultures and civilizations in the world.
Pada tahun 90-an kemudian muncul deklarasi Kairo. Menurut saya ini dikarenakan masih adanya persepsi pada waktu itu tentang pemilahan peradaban, bahwa ada dunia Islam yang terpisah dari dunia Barat yang berada dalam hubungan persaingan atau bahkan konflik. Ini saya kira bisa dimengerti karena dunia memang mengalami sejarah yang panjang sekali, sejak era yang mungkin cukup awal di dalam sejarah Islam sampai dengan abad ke-20, bahwa hubungan antara dunia Islam dengan dunia Barat memang sangat problematik. Ada konflik berkepanjangan sedemikian rupa sehingga persepsi ini mengendap di dalam kesadaran banyak umat Islam di dunia. Saya kira lahirnya deklarasi Kairo itu dilatar belakangi oleh persepsi semacam ini. Walaupun sebetulnya kalau kita baca isi dari deklarasi Kairo itu sendiri sebetulnya tidak sungguh-sungguh secara substansial bertentangan, tidak ada yang secara substansial bertentangan dengan UDHR. Semua yang dinyatakan di dalam deklarasi Kairo itu pun sebetulnya cukup bersesuaian dengan apa yang ada di dalam UDHR. Nah, hanya saja memang ada hal-hal yang di dalam deklarasi Kairo itu menghendaki atau menyiratkan kehendak untuk melestarikan sejumlah nilai-nilai yang dimapankan di dalam jurisprudensi Islam. Nah, menurut saya pertama bahwa umat Islam sekarang tidak bisa lagi meneruskan persepsi tentang pemilahan peradaban seperti yang dimiliki pada masa lalu. Kita mau tidak mau harus semua umat manusia mau tidak mau harus berintegrasi satu sama lain secara damai dan harmonis. Dan untuk itu maka sekali lagi kita semua harus menemukan satu dasar nilai bersama, nilai keadaban bersama, suatu shared civilizational values yang bisa kita jadikan konsensus bersama. Nah, dulu di dalam sejarah Islam sempat muncul dan dimapankan sejumlah jurisprudensi yang apabila dipaksakan untuk terus diterapkan pada era masa kini pasti akan tidak lagi dianggap relevan. Misalnya kita harus akui bahwa pada masa lalu ada jurisprudensi di dalam wacana keislaman yang berisikan norma-norma diskriminatif berdasarkan agama. Hal ini muncul karena konteks realitas kesejarahan yang melingkupi lahirnya jurisprudensi tersebut. Sekarang, konteks realitas telah berubah. Hubungan yang problematik yang cenderung bersifat konfliktual antara dunia Islam dengan peradaban yang lain, termasuk peradaban Kristen Eropa atau Barat, sekarang tidak bisa lagi kita teruskan. Oleh karena itu, jurisprudensi yang masih mengandung norma-norma diskriminatif ini harus dikontekstualisasi. Dunia Islam harus berani meninjau kembali elemen-elemen yang problematik di dalam jurisprudensi yang mapan selama ini. Ini sebagaimana yang dilakukan oleh Nahdlatul Ulama pada awal tahun 2019 yang lalu dalam satu pertemuan nasional para ulama yang diikuti oleh sekitar 20.000 ulama dari kalangan Nahdlatul Ulama. Pada waktu itu ditetapkan dan dinyatakan bahwa kategori kafir atau infidel tidak lagi relevan di dalam konteks realitas negara bangsa modern. Ini adalah penegasan yang bersifat jurisprudensi tentang satu norma yang harus kita terima bersama sekarang. Walaupun sebetulnya sejak awal berdirinya negara Republik Indonesia, nilai tentang kesetaraan hak, tentang persamaan derajat di antara berbagai kelompok yang berbeda-beda, baik secara etnis maupun agama atau yang lain, sudah menjadi konsensus bersama bagi bangsa Indonesia. Tetapi sampai tahun 2019 ketika Nahdlatul Ulama menyelenggarakan pertemuan nasional ulama itu, belum pernah ada penegasan yang dimaksudkan sebagai jurisprudensi baru untuk menghapuskan norma diskriminatif yang ada di dalam jurisprudensi Islam terkait dengan non-Muslim ini. Nah, hal semacam ini adalah satu contoh langkah yang harus berani dilakukan, ditempuh oleh dunia Islam agar
find
Dunia Islam
breakthroughs in the world.
sungguh-sungguh berintegrasi
We have to
dengan seluruh
truly
umat manusia
find a way to
lainnya
integrate
tanpa ada sekat-sekat,
our
karena
worldviews with those
ini
of other
akan
people's.
menjadi kenyataan peradaban yang tidak bisa lagi kita
Has to form
hindari.
the new reality
Apabila
that
kita tidak
guides our
menerima
thinking
kebersamaan
in the
seluruh
future.
umat manusia dalam satu peradaban yang saling
The
bercampur,
continuity and
maka
the community of
kita akan
humankind
menjadi
is something that we
sumber masalah yang luar biasa bagi
that we
seluruh
have to overcome the problems of the past.
Maka integrasi
And for that reason,
yang harus diperlukan
integration
dan untuk itu
is
seluruh
absolutely
umat manusia harus
for
menemukan konsensus
people of the
atas
world. We have to continue to find these
civilizational values,
consensus
nilai-nilai
principles, these
keadaban
shared
yang
civilizational
bisa
values
diterima bersama,
that are
yang
acceptable,
kemudian
that can be accepted by all
jelas
peoples,
harus terkandung di dalamnya
and
prinsip-prinsip
clearly have to be
penghargaan tentang
articulated
martabat manusia, prinsip-prinsip
in the dignity of
penghormatan
humankind
atas hak-hak
and
asasi
respect
manusia.
for human rights throughout
Tidak
the world.
bisa komunitas manapun tidak bisa
We can't
lagi
reject
berdalih
the rights of any communities
untuk
these
menolak
basic principles.
prinsip-prinsip tentang hak asasi manusia ini dengan dalih karena memegangi
We can't use any
keunikan
excuse
kulturalnya sendiri.
to talk
Karena
about our uniqueness
betapapun
as
juga
a form of division.
tidak ada lagi komunitas
There's no longer any
manusia
point
yang akan bisa mengisolasi diri dari
in
seluruh
isolating ourselves
peradaban
from
dunia
the rest
yang
of the
kita
world.
hidupi bersama.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, you've raised a really important question, and that is the ways in which we process differences among ourselves. And so I'd like to turn to Mr. Hu Ping again and address the one of the basic divisions in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which puts human rights basically into two categories: civil and political rights on one hand, and economic, social, and cultural rights on the other. And what I'd like to ask you is how you see those two categories, especially in light of some of the debates today about the nature of rights and whether or not they're, as Secretary Pompeo put it, whether or not they're expanding or proliferating. Mr. Hu Ping?
我认为呢，严格说来，
Personally
只有
speaking,
前一类权利
I
才
would
算
say
是
that
人权。
only
后一类
rights in the
权
first
利
category
实
are
际
human
上
rights
是福利
in，the fundamental sense.
因为
Rights
前
in
一
the
类
second
权利
category
呢
are actually
是
human
人
welfare
所固有的
benefits.，
只要政府
And
不去阻
because
拦、不去
the
压
former
制，
are inherent to
那就实
human
现了。
beings and they
而
can
后
be
一类
attained
权利的
naturally
实
so
现
long
呢
as the，government
它
does
需要
not bar or
政府的
suppress them.
积极的行动。
Whereas
积极
the
的干预和
fulfillment of the
运
latter
作。
requires active government
我
intervention
当然
and
不反
action.
对政府应该
I,
提
of
供必要
course,
的福利，
am not
但是我
opposed to
不赞
government
成
providing
把
necessary
权利和
welfare,
福利
but
混
I
为一谈。
disagree on
如果我们
confusing
把
rights with
福利
welfare.
也当作权利，
If
当作人
we
权，
confuse the two,
那你
that
看
is,
这个
we
世界
think
上
that welfare
没有
just a
一
matter
个
of
国家
human
可
rights,
以在
then
福利方
since
面
no one
做到十
country
全
can
十
achieve
美，
perfection
那么我
in
们就会
welfare
认为
provision,
世界上各个国家
then
在人
we
权
will
记录
think
上只有
that the
程度上
difference
的差
of
别，
each
没有
each
本质
country's
上的
human
差别。
rights record is just a matter
那
of
举例
degree,
说，
but not a matter of
在
nature.
教育、医
Take,
疗
for example,
和其
social
他社会
programs
服
such
务
as
方面，
education
美
and
国
healthcare
也
or
不是
other
没有不
social
足，
services.
中
The
国
United
也
States
不
cannot
是
be
没有
said
成就。
free of flaws,
两者的
and
差
China
别呢
cannot be
只是
said
程度
short of
上的，
achievements.
而不是性质上
So
的。
the difference
但
in
是
this
美
regard would
国
only be
有
a
言
matter of
论自
degree.
由，中国
However,
没
the
有。
United States has
这
freedom
是
of
本质
speech,
的
and
差别。
China does not.
正是因为
This
这
is a
种差别，
difference
所
in
以我们
nature,
说
is
美国
in
是
its most
尊重人
fundamental
权、
form.
保
It is
障人权的
exactly
国家，
because of this
而
difference
中国
that
呢
we say the
是
United
蔑
states
视
is a
人权、
country
践
that
踏人权的
respects
国
and
家。
protects human rights, whereas
那我
China
这里
is a
尤其强
country
调了
that
基本人
disregards
权，
and tramples
也
on
就是一
human
个
rights.
人
I put
生而
particular
为人
emphasis on
就具有
basic
的权利，
human rights,
不
that
可
is
让渡的
rights
权
that
利，
are
比
innate
如
and
言论自由的权利。
unalienable to a
你看，
peasant,
我有
such
很
as
多朋友
freedom of
来自
speech.
中国大陆，
Many of my
在美
friends
国呢得到
actually
政
came
治庇
from
护，
mainland China
但是还没有
and
加入
have
美
been
国国
granted
籍，
political
他还不是美国的公民，
asylum, yet
因
they
此他们就没有
have
公
not
民
got
的
U.S.
权利，
citizenship, and
也没
so
有
they are not
投票选
citizens.
举总统
They
的
therefore
政
do
治
not
权利，
have full-fledged civil
但是他们
rights,
都享
such
有
as the
言
political
论自
right
由的权
of
利，
voting at a presidential
所以
election.
他们
However, they
是
all enjoy the
在
right
自由国家
of
的
free
自由人。
speech. They are
而在
truly
共产
free
专制的
people
中国呢，
living in a
他
free
们是没
country.
有言
In
论自由这种
contrast,
权利的。
they are
所以
deprived
我
of the
认为
right
这个
to
才
free
是
speech
最根
in
本的区
the
别。
authoritarian China under communist rule. That's the difference.
Well, thank you very much. And but that's a good jumping off point. And I'm going to turn to Professor Glendon. That this discussion that we've been having, that Mr. Hu-Ping pointed out about the distinction between kind of the fundamental or unalienable rights and the ones that are more the result of political compromise from place to place. I think as all of the other speakers have said, we live in a particular time and place. And so is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights relevant to what we're doing today? And if so, how do we apply it in a way that would prompt countries to rededicate themselves to its principles, as you suggested in your opening remarks?
One thing to notice is that the Universal Declaration was far ahead of its time, and that its basic promises, its hopes and aspirations are still awaiting fulfillment. But we can say that after 70 years, 72 years, it remains the principal common standard by which nearly every nation has agreed to be judged. After 70 years, 72 years, there is hardly any flagrant or repeated instance of a serious human rights violation that has escaped publicity. And in fact, most governments now go to great lengths to avoid being blacklisted as notorious violators. But there is still much to be accomplished. And the most serious problem right now, in my view, is that the consensus on which the whole post-World War II human rights idea rested and still rests, it was a fragile consensus in the beginning, and it's more fragile than ever now, because there are some powerful nations that are actually endeavoring to undermine that consensus. Yet millions of men and women now, as then, millions around the world are suffering the denial of their basic human freedoms that belong to them simply because of their humanity. I think that's why the passage of time has not made the Declaration less relevant. It's made it more relevant. And why this is no time, this is really a crisis, as was mentioned at the beginning of our discussions today. This is no time for responsible nations to weaken in their defense of human rights, their promotion of human rights, and their protection of universal human rights.
Well, thank you, Professor Glendon. And as you just pointed out, you say this is no time to weaken. And let me turn back to Pak Yahya and ask him, you may, as you don't know, that one of the great matters of outreach that we here at the State Department have been trying is to reach out to the Muslim world through the organization of the Islamic Conference, through other Muslim organizations, to engage in a pretty robust discussion of human rights and getting control of some of the bad behaviors we see around the world in both the Muslim and the non-Muslim world. So what would you suggest in terms of fostering cooperation between and among the different faith traditions that we see around the world, not just Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, but the Buddhist tradition, the Confucian tradition, and others.
Ya, saya ingin menggarisbawahi apa yang disampaikan oleh Profesor Clinton tadi bahwa UDHR ini adalah cita-cita ideal yang harus kita perjuangkan ke depan. Mungkin tidak ada satupun negara sekarang ini yang sudah sempurna menerapkan prinsip-prinsip yang ada di dalam UDHR ini, karena ini adalah cita-cita yang harus kita capai ke depan. Ini sama dengan apa yang saya sebut sebagai aspirasi peradaban Islam itu. Umat Islam sepanjang sejarah harus terus bergulat untuk mencapai, mewujudkan apa yang menjadi aspirasi mulia dari Islam untuk peradaban umat manusia. Sama seperti ketika Amerika Serikat didirikan dan ditetapkan konstitusi Amerika Serikat itu sebagai aspirasi peradaban Amerika yang ideal untuk Amerika. Demikian juga Indonesia ketika menyatakan kemerdekaan dan menetapkan konstitusi Indonesia sebagai cita-cita peradaban yang ditetapkan, yang hendak diperjuangkan oleh bangsa Indonesia. Kita tahu bahwa tidak langsung sejak cita-cita itu ditetapkan, kemudian kita bisa langsung mewujudkan. Perlu pergulatan yang panjang secara terus-menerus dan seringkali harus menghadapi keadaan-keadaan yang sangat jelek. Tetapi cita-cita awal ini, aspirasi awal yang mendasar itu tidak boleh dilupakan. Walaupun misalnya di dalam sejarah Islam harus dilalui satu masa yang panjang sekali, pergulatan yang panjang sekali sebelum aspirasi tentang peradaban mulia itu bisa dilihat di dalam kenyataan. Tapi perjuangan harus terus dilakukan. Walaupun misalnya tidak di Amerika sendiri, ketika konstitusi ditetapkan, memang belum bisa langsung misalnya dihapuskan perbudakan. Harus menunggu sekian lama sampai ada Abraham Lincoln, dan sesudah itu harus melalui perang sipil yang luar biasa sampai kemudian sekarang berhasil diwujudkan kebebasan dan kesetaraan. Demikian juga bangsa Indonesia, tidak langsung setelah konstitusi Indonesia ditetapkan kemudian cita-cita yang ada di situ terwujud. Kami harus melalui pergulatan sampai sekarang, dan saya harus katakan bahwa sampai sekarang pun bangsa Indonesia belum berhasil mencapai cita-cita sebagaimana ditetapkan di dalam konstitusi kami. Nah, maka sebetulnya yang kita butuhkan sekarang, mengingat bahwa seluruh umat manusia ini nanti akan masuk dalam era menuju peradaban tunggal untuk seluruh dunia yang dihidupi bersama oleh seluruh umat manusia. Maka sebetulnya kerjasama antara dunia Islam dengan dunia Barat misalnya, dengan Cina, dengan India, dan lain sebagainya, ini satu hal yang tidak terelakkan, tidak bisa dihindari, dan harus dilakukan. Nah, saya hanya ingin menyebut beberapa prinsip dalam hal ini, bahwa pertama, kerjasama itu harus lebih dari sekedar kesepakatan-kesepakatan pada tingkat pemerintahan negara-negara. Karena yang kita butuhkan adalah internalisasi nilai-nilai di dalam masyarakat, agar nilai-nilai itu menjadi budaya, agar konsensus tentang aspirasi nilai-nilai mulia, termasuk di dalamnya hak asasi manusia ini, betul-betul diinternalisasi oleh masyarakat, kemudian dihidupi oleh masyarakat, sehingga masyarakat ini nantilah yang akan, karena mereka menginternalisasi nilai-nilai mulia itu, mereka akan terus-menerus melakukan kontrol kepada berbagai penguasa politik, aktor politik, untuk juga melayani aspirasi nilai-nilai mulia ini secara berkelanjutan. Nah, maka kita membutuhkan satu kerjasama yang bisa menembus langsung sampai ke grassroots, ke tingkat masyarakat. Kita membutuhkan konsensus di tingkat masyarakat, satu societal consensus, bukan hanya political consensus di antara pemerintahan negara-negara saja. Nah, itu berarti kita perlu melibatkan berbagai macam aktor di kalangan masyarakat sipil, organisasi-organisasi masyarakat untuk bisa diberi peran di dalam perjuangan bersama untuk menegakkan nilai-nilai hak asasi manusia ini yang sebetulnya ini menjadi aspirasi dari seluruh umat manusia. Seluruh umat manusia ingin menjadi manusia yang bermartabat, yang mulia, yang bebas, yang dihormati hak-haknya. Maka semua orang yang berkehendak baik ini perlu bergabung dalam konsensus untuk mewujudkannya, dalam perjuangan untuk mewujudkannya. Nah, sekarang ini kita mewarisi sejumlah masalah yang bisa menjadi hambatan, bahkan menjadi ancaman yang berbahaya. Misalnya, pertama, kita mewarisi satu kebiasaan untuk menjadikan agama sebagai alat politik untuk menyerang lawan. Kalau kita lihat konflik-konflik yang terjadi di berbagai belahan dunia ini, banyak diantaranya, mungkin sebagian besar diantaranya, dipicu oleh pihak-pihak yang menjadikan agama sebagai senjata politik untuk menyerang pihak lain. Yang kedua, kita sekarang ini ada kecenderungan untuk menjadikan sejarah sebagai senjata politik. Keluhan grievances yang dialami oleh satu komunitas di masa lalu di dalam sejarah, kemudian dijadikan alasan untuk menyerang, untuk melakukan balas dendam, untuk menagih pembalasan kepada pihak yang dulu dianggap menjadi penyebab adanya grievances itu. Nah, ini harus kita akhiri. Kita harus bisa melihat kenyataan bahwa umat manusia ini mengalami sejarah begitu panjang, penuh dengan masalah, sehingga mungkin setiap kelompok, setiap orang punya alasan untuk mendendam, membenci kelompok yang lain karena pengalaman sejarah di masa lalu. Sekarang kita sudah ada di dalam kondisi seperti yang kita punyai hari ini. Kita tahu bahwa kita harus mencapai cita-cita ideal bersama. Maka mari kita lihat secara jujur apa hal-hal masalah-masalah kita hadapi bersama dan bagaimana kita mencari jalan keluarnya. Dengan pertama-tama jelas jujur mengakui adanya masalah-masalah yang ada. Kalau masalah tidak diakui dengan jujur, kita tidak mungkin bisa memikirkan jalan keluarnya.
Very good. Thank you very much. We're just about out of time here, and so I want to turn to our other two panelists quickly for a wrap up. The question that Professor Glendon raised early was to get other countries to rededicate themselves to the principles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. What I'd like to ask first, Mr. Hu Ping, and then Professor Glendon, the same question, what advice would you have for other governments with respect to that rededication, and in particular for Mr. Hu Ping, for those who speak to the Chinese people who live not only around the world, but also in both mainland China and Taiwan. Mr. Hu Ping first, and then Professor Glendon.
我想在今天的中国，中国大陆
In
人
today's
权状
China,
况
that is
十分的
mainland
恶劣
China,。
我们
the
在这里的
human
时候，我
rights
们尤其有
have
必要
seen
再一次
great
呼吁强调
suffering.
人权
I
的
would
普
say that
适
I
性。
here, so
人
I
权
would
普世的
urge
道
people
理
to
非
understand
常
the
简单，
universal nature of
它
human
就是基
rights.
于这么一
Well,
种
why
几乎是自
they are
明的一个命
universal?
题。
I will say that
因
because they
为
are
没
based
有
on
一
a
个国家的人
self-evident
民
proposition.
喜欢那
Because
种
no
专
one
横的、不准批评、
person
不
in
准反
any
对的政
country
府，
likes a
没有一
government
个国
that
家的人
is
民甘愿
peremptory
因
or
为仅仅发表的
does
批
not
评意
like
见就被
criticism
监禁、被
or
屠杀，
anyone in
也
any
没有一个
country
国家的
would
人
like the
民
government
愿意在
that
政府的抓
he
捕
or
的
she
审评
will
面前
be
被
put in
剥夺
jail
了
or even
向
killed
公
just
众
because they're
公开
critical of the
辩护的这
government.
种权利。
Or any people in
那么
any
在
country
今天
would
的中
like their
国，我认为最主要的一
opportunity
点、最重要
of
的一点，
defending
首
themselves
先就
in
是
the
要
public
实现
when being arrested
言
or
论自
tried
由
by the
这
government
一
taken
个
away.
基本
So
的
I
人
would
权。
say, though, that
要做到这
we
一
would
点，
have to
其实非常
uphold the
简
very
单，
basic
它并不是
right
要求
to
中国政府
freedom of
做什
speech.
么，
Well,
而是
I'm
要
not
求
saying that
中
the
国政府
Chinese
不
government
去
should
做什么。
do something. I
也
would
就
rather
是
say that the
别人发表
the
了什
Chinese
么
government
意
not
见，
to
发
do
表了什么
something.
观点，
That is
你政
when
府
people
不
are
要去
critical
抓，不
of
要
the
去关
government,
押，
that the
不要
government
去封
should
杀，
refrain
这就
itself
够
from
了。所以
arresting
这是
or
完全做得
punishing
到的。
these people
而
or,
在这
or
方面
even
呢，
killing
中
them.
国
And
过
that,
去
that's good enough
有
for
着
me.
非常
So
惨
in
痛
the
的经验
past,
教训。 那
we
么基
have
于
seen
这种经
great
验教训的吸取，
disasters as a
所以在
result
今
of
天
such oppression by the
我们强
government.
调言论自由，无
So
论如
I
何
would say
都不是
that
过分
we
的。
have to uphold freedom of speech any given time. This is something we should do.
Thank you. Professor Glendon?
Thank you. I think I'd like to close by recalling the hopes of the framers of the UDHR, that the common standard, the very abstract common standard set by that document, would inspire a kind of competition in excellence among the member nations. And that would give us a kind of a collection of examples of the different ways in which that common standard and those very abstract principles could be brought to life within different cultures and traditions. Examples of how well each country, if it was giving itself a report card, how well each country was progressing in the aim of providing better standards of life in larger freedom for its citizens. It's good to remember that human rights, after all, are just words on paper unless they are brought to life within rights-respecting cultures, protected by laws and institutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Glendon, and thank you to Pak Yaya and Mr. Hu Ping. We really do thank you for your participation today. And you've really brought to life the conversation that I know Secretary Pompeo wanted to start around the world with respect to the principles that on which the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is based. I'd like to thank the 57 member states so far that have signed on to our joint statement calling on all nations to recommit themselves to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That statement can be found on the United States UN website, as can the list of countries that has signed on so far. We hope that other countries will join, and I can commit certainly to continuing this conversation over the next few months. We at the State Department will be engaging with scholars and human rights advocates from a number of other traditions and cultures, including Judaism, Buddhism, Shia Islam, humanist, and many others. This is a conversation that needs to go on, and if I can point out to in my wrap up to point out that we have a lot of problems out there to solve. This discussion is very useful. We have some very, very interesting challenges. The use of artificial intelligence, for example, to manipulate people's freedom of speech. So there's many, many issues out there, many, many challenges. And we thank you all today for your attention. We thank you for listening in, and that we hope that you will engage with us in a continued discussion about the principles undergirding the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Thank you, and good day.